Hello. My name is Philippe Diaz, and I'm member of the EFRAG Sustainability Reporting Technical Expert Group. I will present to you today ESRS E4 in these educational sessions on the first set of draft ESRS. Today I'll present to you an overview of the objectives of this draft standard, ESRS E4. It was submitted to the European Commission in November 2022, and I will provide you with more detailed insights into each disclosure requirement that is contained in this draft standard. Let's start with a high-level overview of ESRS E4. The disclosure requirements were designed to generate data with the objective in mind to help users understand how the undertaking affects biodiversity and ecosystems, both in terms of positive and negative, material, actual, as well as potential impacts. Also, in regards to the actions taken and the results of such actions to prevent, mitigate, or remediate actual or again, potential adverse impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, and also in order to protect and restore those. The third objective was to understand the plans and capacity of the undertaking to adapt its business model and operations in line with international frameworks and strategies. Very prominently here, of course, the Kunming and Montreal Agreement negotiated in December 2022 by the Convention on Biological Diversity. Another objective was to understand the nature and type as well as extent of the undertaking's material risks and opportunities related to the undertaking's impacts and dependencies on biodiversity and ecosystems, and also on how the undertaking manages them. This is very important also for the last objective, to understand the financial effects on the undertaking over the short, medium, and long-term time horizons in regards to material risks and opportunities that arise from the undertaking's impacts and dependencies on biodiversity and ecosystems. On this slide, you can see all the disclosure requirements included in ESRS E4. They cover disclosure requirements that fall into the categories of 1, general disclosures, 2, impacts, risks, and opportunity management, and 3, metrics and targets. Here, I have to make a short addition because while the categories were kept the same across all standards, impacts, risk, and opportunity management for biodiversity essentially means impacts, dependencies, risk, and opportunity management. Dependencies was not added here specifically, simply to ensure that the language is as aligned as possible, also in the titles. The structure is aligned with the structure from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and which is particularly relevant for ESRS E4, the structure of the draft framework that was published by the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which uses the same structure as TCFD. You can also see that in this case, what other frameworks and regulation the disclosure requirements overlap or are based on. There's a significant number of additional overlaps beyond the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, or the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, SFDR. For example, in regards to the task with the framework provided by the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which plays a role in a number of disclosure requirements, as well as KPIs proposed in the draft update of the biodiversity standard by the Global Reporting Initiative. However, both TNFD and GRI are with their work at a draft stage, since hence they are not mentioned here. It is also important to note that these requirements of this standard, as well as other topical standards, should be read in the context of ESRS 1 general requirements and also ESRS 2 general disclosures. That means that the topical standards, such as this one, ESRS E4, do not stand alone, but should be understood against the background of these other cross-cutting standards. Under general disclosures, there's a transition plan on biodiversity and ecosystems, also additional data points on the disclosure requirements related to the strategy and business model of the firm, as well as impacts, risks, and opportunities stemming both from ESRS 2. Subsequently, under impacts, risks, and opportunities management, the undertaking is asked to disclose against the policies as well as actions and resources related to biodiversity and ecosystems put in place to fulfill these policies with life. Lastly, metrics and targets include disclosure requirements on those very same, plus one disclosure requirement on the potential financial effects related, or the actual and potential financial effects related to transparency provided against the aforementioned disclosures. Now we're going to take a closer look at the individual disclosure requirements that were just presented on the previous slide. We're going to start with E4.1, the transition plan on biodiversity and ecosystems. The DR is only mandatory for undertakings stemming from economic sectors mentioned on the slide. These were matched with the priority sectors provided by TNFD. So yeah, they may not match exactly as they were referred to by TNFD because the ESRS uses slightly different terminology in regards to the standards stemming or contained in ESRS SEC1. But the general focus of these priority sectors and the sectors focused on by or the names of the sector-specific standards are largely the same. The undertaking, if the undertaking has a transition plan, it shall disclose its plans for its operations throughout its upstream and downstream value chain, as well as how the business development strategy interact with the achievability of transition plan. The mitigation hierarchy plays an important role here, as well as the undertaking is also asked to disclose against biodiversity offsets that it may plan to take into consideration or make use of as part of its transition plan. Here again, this needs to be put in context via the mitigation hierarchy. The mitigation hierarchy will also play an important role in our disclosure requirements, simply to ensure that users of sustainability reporting information understand what level of ambition the undertaking is going to aim at, because the lower the level of actions that are allocated to the levels of the mitigation hierarchy is, there's a tendency the lower the level of ambition. So that level of transparency is important for users of sustainability information. Other data points that the undertaking shall disclose when it has a transition plan in place is the level of approval to which the transition plan is subjected to, how the process of implementing and updating the transition plan is managed, the metrics and related tools used to measure the progress, and the current challenges and limitations to draft a plan in relation to areas of significant impact and action the company is taking to address. That being said, if the undertaking did not yet adopt a plan, the undertaking shall provide information, an explanation on how it's on its biodiversity and ecosystems related ambition. This is a very general requirement, but also to report whether and when it will adopt a transition plan. This disclosure requirement shall help to understand how resilient the strategy and business model of the undertaking is from a biodiversity and ecosystem perspective. It functions as an add-on to ESRS 2 and SBM 3, but just taking an additional biodiversity ecosystems lens on top of that disclosure requirement from the cross-cutting standard. The description of the integration of the material impacts, here in this case, impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities in the business model shall include an assessment of the resilience of the current business model and strategy to biodiversity and ecosystems related physical and transition risks, the scope of the resilience analysis, the key assumptions made in regards to that analysis, the time horizon over which the analysis has been conducted, the results of that analysis, and also very important, as can be seen when looking at the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, also the involvement of stakeholders, especially including indigenous people. This DR disclosure requirement is an add-on to ESRS 2, IRO1, again from a biodiversity and ecosystem perspective. It asks the undertaking to identify the impacts, again in brackets, dependencies, risks, and opportunities related to biodiversity and ecosystems. And here the undertaking is supposed to look at both its own sites as well as after phase in the value chain. The sustainability matters covered by ESRS E4 are listed in application requirement 4 of the standard, which is contained in Appendix B. It includes the 5 direct drivers of biodiversity loss as defined by IPBES, and which are namely climate change, land use change, freshwater use change, sea use change, direct exploitation, invasive alien species, and pollution, as well as others. Beyond that, our sustainability matters that fall within the scope of ESRS E4 are the impacts on the extent, state of species, impacts on the extent and condition of ecosystems, and also impacts and dependencies on ecosystems at large. You can see that, especially via the direct drivers, there's a strong connection with other environmental standards, and ESRS E4 does essentially also function as a starting point for reporting on the other standards. So if, for example, climate change has been identified as a direct driver, as a sustainability matter that is material to the firm, then it would basically trigger reporting via ESRS E1. Furthermore, the undertakings ask whether under this DR, whether in identifying material impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities, it has used scenarios to do so. And only if the undertaking has made use of scenarios, it shall disclose why the scenarios taken into consideration were exactly those used, how those scenarios are updated according to evolving conditions and emerging trends to basically stay up to date, also in regards to new agreements that are being put forward by the Convention on Biological Diversity, and whether the scenarios are informed by expectations in authoritative intergovernmental instruments and where relevant also scientific consensus. The undertaking shall also specifically disclose under this disclosure requirement the definition of the time horizon used for the analysis, whether and how it has used the scenario analysis in the assessment process, which is similar to the previous slide to the data point, and whether or not it has located sites in or near biodiversity sensitive areas, and whether activities in those sites or near those sites, near those biodiversity sensitive areas negatively affect those. And the last data point stems directly from the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. On this slide, you can see a number of additional data points that are related to the principal adverse impacts from the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR, which the undertaking is asked to disclose against. These are specifically not part of the materiality analysis, but they shall be disclosed by the undertaking without being subject to the materiality analysis of the undertaking. In E4.2, policies related to biodiversity and ecosystems, the undertaking is asked to disclose those that cover material impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. The undertaking is also asked whether and how they relate to the Kunming-Montreal Agreement of COP15 by the Convention on Biological Diversity. Here, short note, there are edgy brackets across the standard concerning references to this agreement, which was not finalized at the time of completing the draft standard in November of 2022. Hence, EFRAG asked the European Commission to put specific attention to this matter when reviewing and potentially updating to an extent the proposals by EFRAG. Here you can see a number of additional data points requested from undertakings in regards to their policies. This includes whether and how the policies support the traceability of products, components, and raw materials with significant actual or potential impacts on biodiversity in ecosystems along the value chain. Here, very specific. It also includes on how policies address production, sourcing, or consumption from ecosystems that are managed to maintain or enhance conditions for biodiversity. And lastly, how they address social consequences of biodiversity and ecosystems related impacts. Following the policies, the undertakings asked how it substantiates the policies. The objective of this disclosure requirement is hence to enable an understanding of the key actions taken and planned that significantly contribute to the achievement of biodiversity and ecosystem-related policy objectives and targets. The mitigation hierarchy, including avoidance, reduction, minimization and restoration, and rehabilitation, is mentioned very prominently as a first data point. As stated before, this plays a key part in the standard for users of sustainability information to understand how ambitious the action undertaken by the undertaking actually are. Biodiversity offsets, again, although a highly controversial concept, was also included as a data point. This was to ensure that offsets aren't used but not reported. Therefore, a number of more detailed questions are asked that the undertaking only has to report if biodiversity were in fact used by the undertaking. Additional details that are requested on key action plans are, for example, a list of stakeholders involved, key stakeholders involved, an explanation on the need for appropriate consultation and the need to respect the decisions of affected communities, as well as a number of other points, including how those action plans may induce significant adverse sustainability impacts, whether they are one-time initiatives or rather systematic practice across the entire undertaking, and lastly, whether the action plan is part of a wider action plan, or whether it is just basically with other actors, or whether it's undertaken only by the company itself that is reporting. ESRS E4 also includes disclosures on metrics and targets, and here it is important for the undertaking to also disclose against the methodologies and metrics themselves that were used, what the scope of those were, the biodiversity components of the metrics in particular, a description of the geographies covered in the methodologies because they differ from methodology to methodology. Also, how they consider and respect or integrate the considerations of ecological thresholds, how frequently metrics or the monitoring process has taken place, how these metrics were set up, what kind of data they rely on, whether there's expert judgment included, and so on and so forth. Which actions are measured and monitored via the metrics, and how they relate to the target achievement, whether they are mandatory, for example, based on legislation, or additional voluntary actions or that go beyond reporting what is mandatory, and lastly, whether and how they relate to relevant legislation. Under E4.4, the undertaking shall describe the biodiversity and ecosystem-related targets it has adopted. The detailed data points here are only triggered if the undertaking has set itself targets against material impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. The undertaking is then asked to provide information on the set dates and milestones, as well as whether ecological thresholds were taken into consideration. If not, the undertaking may just report that it hasn't done so. But then it cannot claim that its targets are science-based. It is similar to the concept of climate-related targets and whether they are 1.5 or 2-degree aligned or not. Here, a number of additional data points the undertaking shall disclose in regards to set targets, including whether and how the targets are related or are informed by the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. Here, the language may also be updated by the Commission after the agreement reached in December. Whether or not the undertaking used biodiversity offsets in setting its targets, and lastly, to which of the following layers of the mitigation hierarchy the target can be allocated. E4 contains provisions that request the undertaking to disclose against metrics to help users of sustainability reporting information understand the actual sustainability performance of the undertaking related to biodiversity and ecosystems over time. The first data point is the data point that originates from the SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. So if the undertaking identified sites located in or near biodiversity sensitive areas that it is negatively affecting, then it shall disclose the number and area in hectares of sites owned, leased, or managed in or near these protected or key biodiversity areas. Moreover, to introduce a concept similar to Scope 3 emissions from ESRS E1, the undertaking is also asked to disclose against its land use based on a life cycle assessment. This is only required if the undertaking has identified material impacts in regards to land use change or the extent and conditions of ecosystems. Metrics to be disclosed as per ESRS E4 are largely principle-based. The reasoning was mainly based on the fact that still a large number of potentially useful metrics exist in the realm of biodiversity and ecosystems. This differs from all other environmental standards, where specific metrics are pregiven. Explicit reference is made to the recommendations by a line in the report, the recommendations for a standard on corporate biodiversity measurement and valuation. Hence, if the undertaking identified that it directly contributes to the direct impact drivers of accidental or voluntary introduction of invasive alien species, it shall disclose how it manages pathways of introduction and spread of invasive alien species and the risk posed by those. As you can see, a metric is not provided, but rather provisions added on what metrics or disclosure by the undertaking shall contain. This is the same approach for the following data point. If the undertaking contributes to the impact driver of land use change, freshwater use change, or sea use change, then the following criteria shall be considered. For example, the conversion over time of the land cover, changes over time in the management of ecosystem, and so on and so forth. If the undertaking identified material impacts related to the state of species, it shall report metrics it considers relevant and that may be referred to in ESRS E1, E2, E3, or E5. It shall consider the population size, range within specific ecosystems, as well as the extinction risk, and consider to include one or more indicators that measure changes in the number of individual species within a specific area. And lastly, include one or more indicators when disclosing information on the species at global extinction risk, with 2 examples provided. Same principle, if the undertaking identified material impacts related to ecosystems, it shall consider per ecosystem category 2 aspects to obtain insights into the health of ecosystems. And these 2 categories that it shall consider are the ecosystem extent as well as the ecosystem condition. This is the last disclosure requirement that relates to the potential financial effects from biodiversity and ecosystem-related impacts, risks, and opportunities. All other environmental standards include such a disclosure requirement that helps basically to gauge the potential financial effects from biodiversity and ecosystem-related impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities that the undertaking is exposed to. Here, the undertaking is requested to provide an understanding of the ideally quantitative effects it is exposed to. However, since this is for now rather difficult to do, it was recommended to apply a phase-in to quantitative disclosures and focus on qualitative disclosures first because of the difficult nature of these estimates. So while the undertaking is asked for a quantification, in monetary terms, the data point is phrased very softly, and undertakings do have the opportunity to disclose only qualitative information if quantitative information is considered impractical or it doesn't meet qualitative characteristics of the information stipulated in the cross-cutting standards. Furthermore, a description of the efforts considered related to impacts, dependencies, and the time horizon in which they materialize are included in this disclosure requirement. Lastly, the undertaking is asked to provide an indication of the critical assumptions used for the estimates. This concludes this glimpse into EFRAG's first set of ESRS on the ESRS E4, and I hope you found it informative. Be sure to also view our other videos in the series, and for your colleagues or other interested stakeholders who want a short introduction to the standard, please refer them to the site of videos called Glimpse into EFRAG First Set of Draft ESRS, which is available for each standard on the website from EFRAG. Thank you very much.